Please subscribe and share for more story. The cold November air cut through Margaret Hale's thin blouse as she stood frozen on the stone porch of her son's grand house in Ridgewood Heights. The heavy wooden door had just slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing like a judge's gavel. She did not move. She simply stared at the glowing windows, replaying the words that had driven her outside. Apologize or leave my house. Those words had not been shouted. They had been spoken calmly by Andrew Hale, her only son. Calm made them worse. Calm meant final. Margaret was 67 years old, and she had just been dismissed like a nuisance. 3 hours earlier, she had arrived hopeful, holding grocery store flowers she could barely afford. Now she stood alone, the night wrapping around her like exile. She whispered his name once, Andrew, but the door did not open. Inside, laughter floated faintly. She pressed her lips together and inhaled sharply. She would not cry here. Not on this porch. Not for them. The dinner that led to her exile had begun stiffly, exactly as Margaret feared. Vivian Hale, Andrew's wife, sat regally on a pale sofa, her designer dress clinging like armor. Vivian smiled politely when Andrew looked her way, then dropped it the moment he turned. Throughout dinner, Vivian dominated the table. We're skiing in Aspen again, she said brightly. Andrew surprised me. Andrew smiled. She deserves it. Margaret nodded silently. Vivian continued, touching the diamond at her throat. He bought me this necklace. I told him not to. It was only $13,000. Margaret flinched, but said nothing. She focused on her plate, food arranged like art but tasting of nothing. She had learned survival through silence. Then it happened. Vivian reached vaguely toward the center of the table. Margaret slid the salt shaker toward her. Vivian recoiled. Margaret, must you? I was just helping, Margaret said softly. You always interfere, Vivian snapped. Tears appeared instantly. Andrew's chair scraped loudly. Mom, he said coldly. You need to stop. Vivian sobbed into her napkin as Andrew wrapped an arm around her. She disrespects me constantly, Vivian cried. I try so hard, Andrew. Margaret opened her mouth, then closed it. She had seen this before. She had learned that defending herself only made things worse. Andrew did not look at her with confusion. He looked at her like a problem. Mom, he said flatly, you should go. Margaret stood, hands trembling, dignity stitched together by habit. I only wanted to help, she whispered. Andrew was already turning back to Vivian. I know. Just go. At the door, he stopped her. Next Saturday, we're hosting friends, he said. You will apologize to Vivian. Publicly. Or don't come back. Vivian stood behind him, tears gone, a faint victorious smile on her lips. Margaret nodded once. I'll come, she said calmly. I'll apologize. Andrew seemed relieved. Vivian looked pleased. Neither noticed the change in Margaret's eyes. Margaret rode the bus home through quiet streets, hands folded tightly in her lap. Her reflection in the window looked older than she remembered. But beneath the pain, something else stirred. Resolve. She had endured silence for 3 years. She would not endure lies. That night, alone in her apartment, memories flooded her. Andrew had been born during a thunderstorm, his father gone before he arrived. Margaret had worked 2 jobs, slept 4 hours a night, and never complained. Andrew had been her world. You're my team, she used to tell him. Now she was an obstacle. The next afternoon, fate intervened. Margaret spotted Vivian outside a downtown cafe, laughing with a man in a sharp suit. She watched discreetly as Vivian accepted a thick folder and passed him a white envelope. Money. No hugs. No affection. Business. Margaret's instinct screamed. She called her old friend Ruth Calder, a retired union organizer. I need help, Margaret said. Ruth sighed. Then we dig. 2 days later, Margaret sat across from Daniel Reyes, a private investigator with tired eyes and a calm voice. This won't be cheap, he warned. I understand, Margaret said. She handed over her savings without hesitation. For 2 weeks, she waited. Then Daniel called. Margaret, he said, you were right. They met at a diner. He laid out documents. Vivian's family was bankrupt. The mansion was mortgaged. Andrew's savings had been transferred into Vivian's control. Fake investments. Real debt. Margaret felt dizzy. He trusted her. She counted on that, Daniel said. He showed her messages. Vivian calling her the old woman. Planning public scenes. Training Andrew to choose. Margaret closed her eyes. The salt shaker. The tears. It was all planned. What do I do? She whispered. Daniel leaned forward. You let her stage her performance. Margaret nodded slowly. Saturday. Saturday night arrived. Margaret wore a simple navy dress she had once worn to Andrew's graduation.
She stood taller than she felt.
Vivian opened the door, smiling smugly. Glad you came. The house was full. Laughter.
Wine.
Judgment. Vivian clinked her glass. Margaret has something to say. Margaret stepped forward. You're right, Vivian. I owe you an apology. Vivian smiled. Andrew relaxed. I apologize, Margaret continued, for not seeing the truth sooner. The room stilled. I apologize for allowing you to steal my son's savings. Gasps erupted. Daniel entered quietly and placed documents on the table. Vivian screamed. Andrew grabbed the papers. His face drained of color. Is this true? He whispered. Vivian lunged toward Margaret. Andrew stepped between them. Get out, he said hoarsely. Vivian fled. The room emptied. Silence fell. Andrew collapsed to his knees. Mom, he sobbed. Margaret knelt beside him and held him like she had when he was small. I'm here, she said simply. The weeks that followed were painful. Lawyers. Divorce.
Loss.
But truth remained. Andrew moved into a small apartment near Margaret's. They cooked together again.
Talked. Laughed.
One Sunday, Andrew brought a box. Old photos. Pancakes. Memories. I forgot who loved me, he said. Margaret smiled gently. I never did. In the days after that night, Andrew barely slept. He replayed every conversation, every moment where he had dismissed his mother's discomfort as weakness. The house felt hollow without Vivian's voice filling every corner. He sat alone at the dining table where everything had unraveled, staring at the polished surface as if answers might rise from it. I ruined everything, he told Margaret during one quiet visit. You were deceived, she replied gently. There's a difference. Andrew shook his head. I chose her over you. Margaret placed a cup of tea in front of him. You chose what you thought was love. That doesn't make you evil. It makes you human. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw lines he had never noticed before. Lines carved by years of sacrifice he had forgotten. Shame tightened his chest. I believed her when she said you were trying to control me, he whispered. Margaret sighed. She didn't need to control you. She only needed to isolate you. The truth settled heavily between them. Legal proceedings moved quickly once the evidence surfaced. Vivian's composure vanished under scrutiny. Andrew learned how deeply entangled his finances had been in lies. I signed everything without reading, he admitted to his lawyer. You trusted your spouse, the lawyer replied. That's common. Andrew sold the house. It felt like tearing down a monument to deception. He moved into a modest apartment close to Margaret's place. The first night there, he called her. I don't know how to be alone, he confessed. You won't be, Margaret said. We'll take it one day at a time. Slowly, Sundays returned. Cooking together. Old movies. Silence that felt safe instead of heavy. Andrew began asking questions again, the way he had when he was young. How did you keep going when Dad left? Margaret smiled faintly. Because quitting wasn't an option. Andrew nodded, absorbing the lesson too late, but not too late to matter. One afternoon, Andrew brought out old notebooks he had kept from college. You saved all of these, Margaret said, surprised. I almost threw them away, he admitted. Vivian said they made the apartment look cluttered. Margaret said nothing. She simply touched the worn pages. Andrew swallowed hard. She erased parts of me, didn't she? Yes, Margaret said softly. But you let her. That truth stung, but it also freed him. Andrew began therapy. He learned how validation had become his addiction, how he had mistaken status for worth. "I wanted to prove I was more than where I came from," he told Margaret one evening. "You never had to," she replied. "You already were." He cried then, openly, without shame. Margaret sat beside him, not fixing, not lecturing, simply present. Healing, she knew, did not need speeches. It needed consistency. Months passed. The divorce finalized. Vivian disappeared from their lives, her carefully crafted image shattered beyond repair. Andrew focused on rebuilding. He took a new job, smaller but honest. "I sleep better," he admitted. Margaret noticed changes. He listened now. He apologized without being prompted. One evening, he cooked dinner for her. Burned the sauce. Laughed instead of getting defensive. "I forgot how peaceful life could be," he said. Margaret smiled. "Peace doesn't shout. That's why people miss it." Andrew nodded slowly. "I used to think strength meant control," he said. "Now I think it means accountability." Margaret raised her glass of water. "That's wisdom." They toasted quietly, not to victory, but to truth. One Sunday morning, Andrew arrived early, holding a familiar blue ribbon. "You kept this?" Margaret asked.
"Science fair," he said.
"I almost forgot how proud you were." "I never forgot," she replied. They hung framed photos together later that day. Pancakes at the diner followed. "You know," Andrew said, "she hated this place." Margaret chuckled. "That's because it reminds people where they belong." Andrew looked around at the worn booths, the smiling waitress who remembered his name. "I belong here," he said quietly. Margaret reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Andrew's friends changed too. The old crowd faded. New ones arrived. People who valued substance over appearance. "You're different," one colleague remarked. "I had a hard lesson," Andrew replied. Margaret watched her son grow humbler, stronger. She did not gloat. She did not remind him of the pain. Love did not keep score. One evening, Andrew said, "I want to make things right." "You already are," Margaret said. "No," he insisted. "I want to honor you." He began volunteering, donating quietly, showing up. Margaret observed silently, proud without needing acknowledgement. Sometimes Andrew asked, "Why didn't you fight sooner?" Margaret answered honestly, "Because mothers are taught to endure." "That shouldn't be true," he said. "It shouldn't," she agreed. They sat together, watching the sunset. "I won't let anyone silence you again," Andrew promised. Margaret smiled. "I won't silence myself again either." That was their pact. The following winter, Andrew invited Margaret to dinner. Not an apology. Not a performance. Just dinner. "I cooked," he said proudly. She tasted the food. "Needs salt." He laughed and passed the shaker without hesitation. They shared a quiet smile. Margaret reflected often on the journey. How close she had come to disappearing from her own child's life. Strength, she realized, was not endurance alone. It was discernment. Silence had protected peace once. Speaking had restored truth. Andrew rebuilt slowly. He paid debts, regained confidence, learned patience. "I'm not in a hurry anymore," he told her. "That's growth," Margaret replied. One evening, Andrew said, "I was afraid of becoming my father." "You didn't," Margaret said firmly. "You became accountable. That's better." They celebrated small victories. Promotions. Birthdays. Quiet mornings. Life was no longer loud. It was honest. Andrew began calling every day. Not out of guilt. Out of connection. "How was your day?" he'd ask. Margaret answered truthfully. Always. When people asked Margaret how she stayed strong, she said, "I stopped shrinking." That was the lesson. Andrew told friends, "My mother saved my life." Margaret corrected him. "You saved yourself." Years later, Andrew would look back and understand. Love that demands silence is not love. Wealth without truth is empty. Margaret lived peacefully. No grudges. No bitterness. Only clarity. She had not won a battle. She had reclaimed her voice point one night at the diner. Andrew squeezed her hand and said, "You're the strongest person I know." Margaret smiled, not sadly, not bitterly, just proud, because truth had endured, and love, real love, had returned home. Thanks for watching.